under his protection. Alexander Volkov sat in his high-rise office sipping a glass of rare whiskey, his gaze drifting toward the expansive skyline of New York City. He had built his empire from nothing, arriving in the United States decades ago as a young man with nothing but ambition and an unyielding will. The Volkov family had once been a powerful force in Russia, but after fleeing political enemies, Alexander carved out a new dominion in America, rising through the ranks of the criminal underworld until his name was whispered with both fear and reverence. Now, he was the head of an international network, controlling vast enterprises from weapons trafficking to legitimate business fronts. His power was absolute, his enemies countless, and his family his greatest strength. His thoughts were interrupted when his right-hand man, Victor, barged in. The usually composed man looked alarmed. "Boss, we have a situation. Your son, Nikolai, was insulted at the hospital." Alexander's amber eyes darkened as he set his glass down. "By whom?" "A low-life criminal family. They're small-time, but their numbers are big, and they have no respect." Alexander's jaw clenched. Nikolai had taken a different path than his siblings, choosing to save lives rather than take them. He had Alexander's utmost respect, and no one disrespected his blood and got away with it. Memories of his own struggles in this ruthless city surfaced. He had fought wars in the streets, built alliances through blood and steel, and had ensured that no one, absolutely no one, could challenge his family without facing consequences. "Prepare the car," Alexander ordered, his voice like steel. "I want to know every detail." The hospital smelled of antiseptic and urgency. Alexander's presence commanded attention as he strode in, flanked by his men. His tailored suit and the way people unconsciously stepped aside for him made it clear he was a man of power. Nikolai was standing outside the ER, still wearing his scrubs, his hands balled into fists. A tense crowd of nurses and doctors whispered around him. Across from him stood a group of thugs, arms crossed, sneers on their faces. Their leader, a burly man covered in prison tattoos, smirked. "We don't take orders from some rich boy in a white coat," the man taunted. "You think you're better than us?" Before Alexander could respond, a firm yet feminine voice cut through the tension. "That's enough," the woman said, stepping between Nikolai and the thugs. "This is a hospital, not a battleground." Alexander's gaze landed on her. She was stunning. Brown waves of hair pulled into a ponytail, piercing green eyes filled with authority. The badge on her belt identified her as Detective Alina Petrov. "Who the hell are you?" the thug spat. "The woman who's about to drag your sorry ass to jail if you don't leave," Alina said coldly. The thug scoffed but seemed to reconsider when her hand hovered over her gun. With a sneer, he motioned for his men to leave, but not before throwing Nikolai a threatening look. "This isn't over." Alina turned to Nikolai. "You okay, doctor?" "I'm fine," Nikolai muttered. "But they disrespected me." Alexander stepped forward. "And that is something I do not allow." Alina's sharp gaze met his. "I don't need a mafia boss turning my crime scene into a war zone." Alexander smirked. "Ah, so you know who I am." "It's my job to know criminals," she shot back. A challenge, he liked that. "And yet, Detective Petrov, I find myself intrigued by you," he said smoothly. Her lips pressed together. "Stay out of my way, Volkov. I don't care about your world. Only the law." He chuckled, a deep, rich sound. "We'll see about that." Alexander didn't let the insult to his son go unanswered. That night, his eldest son, Dmitri, orchestrated a ruthless attack on the gang's black market dealings. His men burned down warehouses filled with contraband, disrupted their smuggling routes, and bribed key officials to turn a blind eye to the Volkov family's retaliation. By morning, the gang's financial veins had been completely severed, leaving them scrambling in chaos. His daughter, Katerina, used her underground network of female operatives to send a message. Any man who thought they could disrespect a Volkov would regret it. Through calculated strikes, she dismantled their extortion rings, liberating women forced into servitude and turning them against their former masters. The gang members found themselves hunted, their allies deserting them in fear of Katerina's retribution. And the youngest of his daughters, Sasha, led her biker crew on a violent rampage through the gang's supply chains. With surgical precision, they raided hideouts, intercepted shipments, and destroyed stockpiles of illegal weapons and drugs. Riding their sleek sports bikes, they moved too fast to be caught, their presence a ghostly warning that the Volkovs were not to be trifled with. By morning, the gang was crippled. Days later, Alexander ran into Alina again. She was investigating the gang's sudden downfall, her sharp eyes reading him like an open book. "You did this, didn't you?" she accused. "I did what was necessary," he replied smoothly. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "You don't just eliminate problems, Volkov. There are laws." He studied her, then stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I respect your law, Alina, but I protect my family my way." Her eyes softened for just a moment before she steeled herself. "I can't be involved with someone like you." Alexander smirked. "Who said anything about being involved?" She turned to leave but hesitated. "Stay out of trouble." "For you?" He smiled. "I'll try." And for the first time in years, Alexander Volkov found himself chasing something other than power. He was chasing a woman who made him feel alive. And he never backed down from a challenge. But his enemies were not finished. The leader of the crippled gang, desperate for revenge, laid out an elaborate trap for Sasha and her biker crew. Using false intel, they lured her and her most loyal riders into an ambush in an abandoned warehouse district. The ambush was brutal. Chains were stretched across the roads to send them flying off their bikes. Gunmen hidden in shadows fired upon them, and smoke grenades clouded their escape. Sasha fought fiercely, but she was outnumbered. She took a bullet to the side before her crew managed to extract her, barely making it out alive. Their bikes were wrecked, their bodies bruised, and by the time the dust settled, Sasha and a handful of her most loyal girls were rushed to the hospital, unconscious and bleeding. When Alexander received the news, fury, unlike anything he had felt in years, consumed him. He stormed into the hospital, his presence like a raging storm, demanding to see his daughter. And there, standing outside the emergency room once more, was Detective Alina Petrov. Their eyes met, hers filled with warning, his with unrelenting vengeance. Alina stepped forward, blocking his path. "Not this time, Volkov. You step 1 foot inside that room, and I swear to God, I'll arrest you." Alexander clenched his fists, his voice a deadly whisper. "That is my daughter in there, bleeding because of scum who dared to challenge me. You think you can stop me?" "I don't think, I know," she shot back. "I let you slide before, but if you interfere, you'll be facing charges you can't bribe your way out of. This is my jurisdiction, and I won't have you turning this hospital into another battlefield." He took a step closer, his towering presence almost overwhelming. "You expect me to stand here and do nothing?" Alina's gaze didn't waver. "I expect you to trust that I'll handle this my way. Your world runs on blood, but mine runs on justice. You want revenge? Then wait. Because if you don't, I won't hesitate to put you in cuffs." For the first time in years, Alexander found himself at an impasse. His rage burned, his instincts screamed for action, but something in Alina's unwavering stance made him pause. With a slow, measured breath, he stepped back, his voice calmer but no less intense. "Then you better make sure justice is swift, Detective, because my patience has limits." Alina gave a curt nod, turning toward the ER doors. "Then don't push me, Volkov." But she didn't waste any time. Using her connections and her relentless determination, she combed through hours of street surveillance hacking into feeds from security cameras placed all over the city. The footage was grainy, but Alina was methodical, rewinding and enhancing every frame until she caught glimpses of the culprits. Tattoos, patches on jackets, distinct gaits, small details that could be traced. One by one, she began identifying them, matching them with police records and criminal databases. They thought they had vanished into the shadows, but she was hunting them down piece by piece. This wasn't just about the law anymore. This was about justice for Sasha and her girls. And she wasn't going to stop until every last one of them paid for what they did. Alina and her partner, Detective Markov, tracked down the identified suspects and interrogated them one by one. Each had an alibi, some flimsy, others airtight, but there was no direct evidence to make an arrest. Frustrated, she returned to the station empty-handed, her determination burning hotter. As she left the precinct to head home, exhaustion weighing on her, a sudden burst of gunfire shattered the night. A black sedan with tinted windows screeched past, bullets whizzing through the air. Alina barely managed to dive behind a parked car, a searing pain ripping through her shoulder as a bullet grazed her. The drive-by shooting ended as quickly as it started, leaving her gasping on the pavement. Moments later, she was rushed to the hospital, Nikolai's hospital. Blood soaked through her shirt, but the wound wasn't fatal. As she was wheeled into the ER, she caught sight of Nikolai's worried face above her, barking orders to his team. And then through the haze of pain she saw him, Alexander Volkov. His amber eyes blazed with fury as he stormed into the ER, his presence dark and commanding. His gaze locked onto hers, and for the first time, Alina wasn't sure whether she was more afraid of the men who shot at her, or the Mafia king who now had a personal stake in her survival. Alexander was at her side in an instant, his voice a low growl of concern. "You shouldn't be here like this. I told you to be careful." Alina grimaced, trying to sit up. "I can take care of myself. I didn't expect a damn drive-by." His jaw tightened, the fury barely restrained. "This is what happens when you get too close to the fire. Someone tried to kill you. That means they fear you, but it also means they won't stop." "I'm a cop, Volkov," she shot back. "I don't get scared off." His lips pressed into a thin line, but there was something else in his gaze, concern. "You're coming with me. You're not safe out there." "I can't." "You will." He cut her off firmly. "You're injured. You won't be able to react fast enough if they come again." Before she could protest further, Nikolai stepped in. "He's right, Alina. Just for tonight. Let someone else take watch." With a reluctant sigh, she nodded. Hours later, Alexander escorted her to his car and drove her home himself. As she stepped into her apartment, she noticed two of his men stationed outside. She turned to him, crossing her arms. "This is unnecessary." "It's not," he countered, his voice softer now. "Until we find who did this, I won't take chances with your life." Alina exhaled, rubbing her temple. "Fine, but don't think this means I owe you anything." Alexander smirked, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "We'll see about that. Get some rest, detective." And with that, he left, but his presence lingered in the air long after he was gone. The next morning, Alina awoke to the scent of fresh roses. A lavish bouquet sat on her kitchen counter, a simple note attached. "Stay safe." She didn't need to guess who sent it. Shaking her head, she got ready for work, only to notice a black SUV parked outside her apartment. Alexander's men, watching her. It irritated her, but she had no time to argue. At the station, she gathered her team in the briefing room. "We're hitting all identified locations simultaneously at 10 p.m. tomorrow," she instructed, marking red circles on the city map. "We go in hard, no warning. We need to bring these guys down before they regroup." Her partner, Detective Markov, gave a curt nod. "Let's hope they don't see us coming." Detective Ramirez crossed his arms. "What about contingencies?" If they get tipped off, we could be walking into a bloodbath. Alina exhaled. We'll have backup teams positioned at all exits. No one leaves. Tactical units will be stationed at the rooftops for sniper coverage. I want a drone team monitoring the situation in real time. Sergeant Collins tapped his pen on the table. And what if they fight back? These guys are armed to the teeth. Then we neutralize, Alina said firmly. Non-lethal if possible. But our priority is shutting them down before they can retaliate. No hesitation. If you hesitate, you die. The room fell into a tense silence. Then Markov spoke. All right. We have our plan. We move at 10 p.m. sharp. Gear up and be ready. The next evening, the team departed from the station, their vehicles moving swiftly through the darkened city streets. Alina sat in the lead car, tension thick in the air as they neared the targeted locations. Unbeknownst to them, Alexander's men had been keeping a close eye on police activity. When word of the raid reached Alexander, he immediately suspected the worst. Boss, Victor reported over the phone, this smells like a setup. My men heard whispers on the street. Those bastards are expecting company. Alexander's expression hardened. Follow them. Stay out of sight. But if things go south, we step in. No one lays a hand on her. As the police convoy arrived at the first warehouse, the silence felt unnatural. The moment Alina and her team breached the entrance, gunfire erupted from hidden positions above. It was a trap. Bullets rained down as the officers scrambled for cover. Smoke filled the air, obscuring vision, and within seconds, the raid had turned into a deadly ambush. Alina took cover behind a crate, firing back as her team tried to regain control. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. A sharp pain tore through her shoulder. She had been hit. Stumbling back, her vision blurred, but before she could react, a new barrage of gunfire exploded from the opposite direction. Alexander and his men had arrived. Moving like ghosts through the chaos, they cut down the gang members with ruthless efficiency. Alexander himself found Alina slumped against a stack of crates, her blood staining her vest. His jaw clenched as he lifted her into his arms. "You're not dying on me, detective," he growled, carrying her out as his men finished off the last of the gang members. Back at Nikolai's hospital, Alina drifted in and out of consciousness, her weakened state fueling Alexander's rage. He couldn't let this go unanswered. He turned to Katerina, his eldest daughter, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "Stay with her. No one touches her unless you approve." Katerina gave a firm nod, already taking her place by Alina's bedside, a silent guardian with a steel-like resolve. Without another word, Alexander stormed out of the hospital, his men already awaiting his orders. "Find the scum responsible. Every last one of them. We end this tonight." By the time they tracked down the gang's leader, the night was thick with tension. The criminals had regrouped, expecting retaliation, but they were not prepared for the wrath of Alexander Volkov. His men moved swiftly and mercilessly, cutting down their ranks one by one until only a handful remained. The gang boss tried to escape, but Alexander caught him, dragging him into the dimly lit alley behind the warehouse. "You thought you could lay a hand on what's mine and walk away?" Alexander hissed, his grip tightening around the man's throat. The gang boss barely managed a gurgled plea before a single gunshot echoed into the night, silencing him forever. The remaining criminals scattered, their empire reduced to rubble. With his revenge complete, Alexander returned to the hospital, his hands still stained with the night's work. He stepped into Alina's room, finding Katerina exactly where he left her. Alina stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find the room dimly lit, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sound. She shifted slightly, feeling the dull ache of her wound. Her gaze landed on Alexander, his large frame hunched over, his head resting on the edge of her bed. The fearsome Mafia boss, the man who ruled an empire of crime and power, was asleep beside her, his usually sharp expression softened by exhaustion. She took a deep breath, taking in the sight of him, the way the tension had momentarily left his face. For all his ruthlessness, there was something undeniably human in the way he had stayed by her side. A warmth spread through her chest. He hadn't left her alone, even when he could have. Carefully, she reached out, her fingers brushing against his dark hair. At her touch, Alexander stirred, his amber eyes blinking open. He straightened, his expression shifting back into focus as he looked at her. "You're awake?" he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. A small smirk tugged at her lips. "You look exhausted, Volkov. That's a rare sight." His jaw clenched slightly as if embarrassed by his moment of vulnerability, but instead of responding with his usual sharp wit, he simply sighed. "You scared me, Alina." She blinked, startled by his honesty. Alexander ran a hand over his face, then stood, composing himself. "Rest. I'll make sure nothing else touches you." He turned toward the door, but before leaving, he paused, looking back at her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. "I don't lose the people I care about, Detective. Sleep easy." Alina had to stay in the hospital for a couple of days for observation, but Alexander, not wanting to disturb her, had sent flowers every day. Of course, his men were everywhere, silently ensuring her safety. Yet, despite his absence, she secretly missed him. On the morning of her release, her partner, Detective Markov, arrived to pick her up. As she stood in front of the hospital doors, a deep sense of unease settled in her chest when a convoy of black SUVs suddenly pulled up, engines humming ominously. Her fingers instinctively brushed over her hip where her holster used to be, but before she could react, the rear door of the lead vehicle swung open. Alexander stepped out holding another bouquet of fresh roses, his amber eyes locking onto hers with an unreadable intensity. The tension in her shoulders melted slightly, replaced by something softer, something she wasn't ready to name. He walked toward her with the confidence of a man who always got what he wanted, stopping just inches away. "Leaving without saying goodbye, Detective?" he murmured, offering her the flowers. Alina exhaled, shaking her head. "I didn't think you'd notice." His smirk was slow and knowing. "I notice everything that matters to me." He glanced at Markov before turning his gaze back to Alina. "If your partner allows it, I'd like to take you home myself." Markov scoffed, crossing his arms. "You think I'm just going to hand her over to you, Volkov?" Alexander remained calm, his voice smooth but firm. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm offering her protection." Alina narrowed her eyes at him before glancing at Markov. "It's fine, Markov. I'll be all right." Markov let out an exasperated sigh. "Fine. But if anything happens to her, Volkov, I'll personally bring hell down on you." Alexander's smirk deepened as he opened the car door for Alina. "Noted, Detective. Now shall we?" As they drove in silence, Alexander's usual composed demeanor wavered. His hands gripped the wheel a little too tightly, his jaw clenched slightly, a rare display of nervousness from the Mafia boss. Alina noticed but said nothing, intrigued by his subtle shift. When they arrived at her apartment, Alexander stepped out first, walking around to open her door. She hesitated before stepping out, the air between them thick with something unspoken. He cleared his throat, something almost hesitant in his usually confident voice. "Alina, would you have dinner with me? At my home?" She arched a brow, surprised by the offer. "Dinner? Are you asking me on a date, Volkov?" He exhaled slowly, a small smirk playing on his lips, but his eyes held a rare sincerity. "Yes, Detective, if you'll allow it." For a moment she considered saying no, keeping the boundaries clear. But something in the way he looked at her, a dangerous man showing an unexpected vulnerability, made her nod. "All right. But don't think this means I'm going easy on you." His smirk widened, satisfaction glinting in his amber eyes. "Wouldn't have it any other way." The next evening, a sleek black luxury car arrived at Alina's apartment to pick her up. As she stepped inside, she was greeted by the soft scent of leather and roses. The ride was smooth, but nothing prepared her for the sight that awaited her at the end of the journey. Alexander's mansion was unlike anything she had expected. Set within a vast estate, hidden behind high walls, it stood as a monument to power and sophistication. The long driveway was lined with towering oak trees, their leaves whispering in the wind. Immaculate gardens stretched around the main house, their vibrant colors standing in contrast to the imposing structure of stone and glass. Despite being in the heart of the city, it felt like a world apart, isolated, private, untouched. When she stepped inside, the grandeur of the interior left her momentarily breathless. High ceilings, chandeliers that cast golden light across the marble floors, and paintings that likely cost more than her entire salary, combined decorated the walls. Yet despite the luxury, there was warmth in the house, a sense of home. Dinner was set in an elegant dining hall, candles flickering between them. Alexander's children were present, watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to amusement. As they ate, Alexander leaned forward, his voice quieter, more personal. "Alina," he began, swirling his wine in the glass. "I never imagined myself here, sitting across from someone who makes me feel like there's more to this life than power and survival." She raised an eyebrow. "That's a dangerous confession, Volkov." He smirked, but then his expression turned serious. "I've only ever loved once, my late wife and my children. My family is not perfect, but it is everything to me. And now, I want you to be part of it." Alina blinked, caught off guard, and before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, a ridiculously large diamond ring glistened under the candlelight. Gasps and murmurs echoed around the table, but Alina's breath caught in her throat. She had grown up in an orphanage, never having a real family. Only the bonds she had formed at the police station. No one had ever offered her something like this, not just wealth, but belonging. "Marry me, Alina," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with rare vulnerability. "Be part of this family." For a long moment she could only stare. Her heart pounded in her chest and a whirlwind of emotions rushed through her. She had never expected this, not from a man like him, not for someone like her. A part of her wanted to push him away, to remind herself that she didn't belong in this world of power, danger, and unyielding devotion. But another part, the part that had always longed for a place to call home, whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had found it. Then, despite herself, she smiled with tears welling up. "Yes, Alexander, but if you think I'm wearing this thing while chasing down criminals, you're out of your mind." A slow, satisfied grin spread across his face before he leaned in, capturing her lips in a deep, lingering kiss. Cheers erupted around them, Dmitri groaning dramatically, Nikolai roaring from happiness, Katerina rolling her eyes with a smirk, and Sasha had tears glistening in her eyes as she threw her arms around both of them. "Welcome to the family," she whispered,